Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about a couple of different topics. Before I start with what is happening and continuing between the war between the Russian Federation, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and its Ukrainian proxy forces, I wanted to actually move over and have a quick discussion about the possibility of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And specifically, this is going to be in regards to another content provider. The content provider is Subbrief. He did a very recent video on the Chinese buildup, the fact that the Chinese are building and or have built a series of roll-on, roll-off bridging ferries. Now, the concept behind these bridging ferries are the same as what we observed during Operation Overlord, to create these long bridges that would extend out to sea, where troops and tanks and armored vehicles and trucks and supplies could be moved on to the localized beaches and then move further inland to conduct ongoing military operations. Now, because that the Chinese have elevated its construction of these ships, these roll-on, roll-off bridging ships, and have begun training, that could be a sign that the Chinese are preparing for some sort of military operation. Now, the problem with this is multifaceted, and it centers on the concept that a Chinese invasion could be disguised by a military exercise. That is something that would not happen. I do not believe that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would be predicated by a actual military exercise, especially the size of recent and ongoing Chinese military exercises. The buildup that would have to take place for a Chinese military operation against Taiwan, especially one that would involve full-on amphibious operations, the full-on amphibious invasion of the main island, not the outlying islands, but the main island of Taiwan, would be on an unprecedented scale. Look, a Chinese amphibious invasion would, in all probability, be one of the most complicated military operations in the history of mankind. Now, why do I say that? Technology. Technology has rapidly changed, even in the last just couple of years since the onset of the NATO-Russian war. Technology has changed. Doctrine has changed. Strategy, tactics have changed. And where the Chinese were setting just a couple of years ago in terms of possible preparatory operations against Taiwan, that has changed also. So if the Chinese were planning within, let's say, the next 90 days, a military operation against Taiwan that involved an actual amphibious operation, meaning landing 100,000 Chinese troops on the island, everyone would know it. You would see what would be happening. You would see the preparation for this operation underway. It would be glaringly apparent by both human intel and satellite intel as well. And furthermore, the Chinese, in all probability, would have to do further training prior to, and much more large scale training prior to a quote unquote amphibious invasion of Taiwan. And and again, I do not believe that a full on amphibious operation to seize control of the island is something that's in the works right now. I don't believe the Chinese would be looking at that sort of strategy. What I do think is likely would be an embargo of Taiwan. That would be something that would be within the realm of Chinese capability. And further, sub-brief, and again, I have a great deal of respect for this content provider. He knows a tremendous amount about naval warfare, and especially when it comes to submarines, subsurface warfare. Now, in one segment of his commentary, he talks about the forward deploying of Chinese carriers. Look, in all likelihood, the Chinese would pull their carriers back. There's no reason for the Chinese to utilize aircraft carriers against Taiwan. There would just be one scenario in which we may see the use of Chinese carriers deployed to the Taiwan Strait in an operation against Taiwan. And that would be if and when the Chinese had established both air dominance and naval dominance, and then were comfortable enough to use those carriers as amphibious warfare ships. They would use them as large helicopter carriers. The Chinese do not need an aircraft carrier in the traditional sense of why an aircraft carrier or how an aircraft carrier would be used in the Taiwan Straits, because the Chinese have access to more than enough air bases that are simply 100 to 200 miles from the Taiwanese mainland. So China would not need to risk those vessels operating near the Taiwan Straits. And if the United States were to enter the fray, enter the conflict, especially with its subsurface technology, Virginia-class nuclear attack submarines, those Chinese carriers would be at great risk. And not only from the threat of U.S. subsurface threats, but Taiwanese assets as well. Taiwan has the capability, if those Chinese carriers are deployed within 100 to 200 miles of the island, Taiwan has the capability of targeting those carriers. And China simply would not want to expend those carriers when that same capability exists on the mainland. Again, launching aircraft against Taiwan. Again, the only reason that China would use those carriers would be an amphibious warfare operation. They would be using them as amphibious warfare assets. Now, back to this concept of what Subbrief was talking about these roll-on, roll-off bridging ferries that would land on the beaches or facilitate the landing of Chinese mechanized units onto the main Taiwan island. Again, incredibly difficult scenario that would require a force construct on par with Operation Overlord, the 1944 invasion of Western Europe by the Allies. That would be the size and scope of this operation by the Chinese. And it would even be more challenging for the Chinese in landing on the island of Taiwan. Why would that be? Well, if you look at what the Allies did in Europe, the Allies had the capability of landing in various areas on the coast of France, and that dispersed German forces. And remember, the Germans were using about 90% of its combat capacity against the Soviet Union. Look, if the Germans weren't fighting the Soviet Union, the Allied invasion of Europe would have never happened. And I'm not going to get into that. But what I am trying to articulate is that the force density that exists on Taiwan is going to be much, much higher than the force density of German forces that opposed the Allied landings in Normandy and possibly other parts of France. And then two, the most important thing is the advancement of technology. Real-time sensor capacity to know exactly what China is doing. China is going to be able to disguise some things. But for the most part, Taiwan is going to have a pretty good idea where the Chinese are going to land. They're going to have a pretty good idea. And they're going to be able to flex forces. They're going to be able to flex capability very rapidly to those locales. That's if China is able to gain air supremacy over Taiwan. And we'll have to see how that plays out. That is not a foregone conclusion. We will have to see if the time comes, if China is able to maintain some form of sea dominance where Taiwan is simply not able to sink Chinese ships that are crossing into the Taiwan Straits. That's, again, technology with modern capability in terms of long-range anti-ship systems, both hypersonic, subsonic, the proliferation of drones and drone capability, the new capability of semi-submersible drones that are being used, not to mention subsurface warfare. That's going to probably play into this as well. And Taiwan's Navy, if you compare and contrast with that of the Ukraine, much more capable Air Force, much more capable naval force as well. So again, this talk of this Chinese amphibious invasion of Taiwan is something I don't really believe is being prepared. The initial operation that China will in all probability launch against Taiwan will in fact be an embargo. It'll be an embargo of the island. It could look a lot like a law enforcement operation. And then that would require Taiwan to then escalate. At what point would Taiwan say, okay, we're not going to allow China to interdict shipping coming to Taiwan? And then who is going to act first? Is it going to be the United States? Is it going to be Taiwan? Now, you could see a more or less semi-cold start operation in which the Chinese would use its air force to degrade and destroy the Taiwanese, the Republic of China's military. Take down its air force, its airfields, and degrade its capability. That's going to take weeks. But this whole concept of this Chinese buildup followed by this disguised operation in which I continue to hear this thought process that the Chinese would start a naval exercise, and then those ships, those roll on roll off ships, those amphibious warfare ships, would just keep going, would end up on a Taiwan beach. A cold start from a military exercise to an actual invasion. That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. Those vessels, as they crossed the medium line, Taiwan would have the ability to sink those amphibious warfare ships. They're not going to do that. China is going to first have to gain air supremacy and naval dominance or in the straits. Then you would see possibly this follow-on amphibious operation. But you're not going to see a naval exercise that's going to immediately turn into an invasion of Taiwan. I would argue that if you did see Chinese carriers operating in the Straits of Taiwan, that the possibility for an actual invasion, for military operations to start, would actually be reduced. Because again, I don't think China wants to lose those assets. And then back to my original point, they don't need those assets to conduct an embargo and or a aerial campaign against Taiwan. And they would have to do an aerial campaign. They have to. Full on air supremacy operation. So I hope that made sense. I hope you, the viewer, understands where we are coming from. That this is, again, much more complicated than what anyone really understands. And I think a lot of times people compare and contrast the size of China and its current perceived capabilities with this capability to suddenly take control of the island of Taiwan. That is a myth. That is a myth that needs to be talked about and understood. Again, a full-on embargo or a amphibious operation against Taiwan, you would see what is happening. You would see this buildup. You would see this massive endeavor by China. And you would know exactly what they're preparing to do. The air campaign component of it, the naval component of it, would be a little bit less obvious, but still nonetheless, they would be moving aircraft into position, into air bases that are closer to Taiwan. You would see the deployment of munitions and supplies that would be needed to carry on what could take many
days or weeks to destroy the Taiwanese Air Force. China cannot guarantee a air supremacy operation in about 3 days. That's really off the table at this point. You just can't do that. It's still an unknown for the Chinese. And again, Taiwan has an immense capability. A capability that oftentimes isn't even discussed. Some of the capabilities that the Republic of China has. So we'll have to see what happens. But again, amphibious operation, you would definitely see it on the horizon. You would know roughly the time frame of when China is looking to start that operation. And then again, even before that, you would see the onset of air dominance and air supremacy operations by China as well. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope that clarifies things a little bit. Now, back to the war between the Russian Federation, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and its NATO proxy forces. Again, we are seeing the Donbas offensive continues. It is making headway. One of the main westerly arterial routes into Pokrovsk has been seized by the Russians. The Russians have fire control over the entirety of the Pokrovsk sector. The Russians have the capacity of hitting any Ukrainian units moving in and out of Pokrovsk at their leisure. Compounding that, Russian operations continue in other sectors as well. Russian forces have entered the town of Dachny. Russian infantry units have entered this town. At the same time, the ability of Ukrainian forces to move in this east by west or west by east direction into Dachny, into this town here, are very much being negated, again, by Russian fire control over this area. Very, very difficult for Ukrainian units to move in and out of this, which has essentially become a pocketed area by Russian forces. And then as we move up further to the north in areas such as Torsk, again, Russian forces continue to dominate the battlefield, continue to push Ukrainian forces out of these areas all the way up towards Kupiansk. And then finally, the ongoing Kursk pocket. The pocket continues to shrink. The Ukrainian military, the only form of real propaganda that they are able to articulate is their claim of essentially causing a lot of Russian casualties. None of that we can verify. Has there been Russian casualties? Of course. Absolutely. And we also have at least 2 Asiatic males that were captured allegedly by Ukrainian forces that they are claiming to be North Korean troops. 2. Now, keep in mind, the Ukrainians have claimed to killed or wounded thousands of North Korean troops. But we have seen 2 Asiatic males, which could be Eastern Siberian-based Russian forces as well. We just don't know. Now, in all probability, are they North Koreans? I would say so. I would say that would be reasonable. But again, this whole concept that we're hearing about the mass fatalities and the mass casualties of North Korean troops can't really be proven. It just can't. We have seen drone footage of what could be a couple of dozen casualties by a military unit, a platoon-sized, company-sized element, but that's about it. That's realistically what we see. And at the same time, this pocket is continuing to shrink and close as the Russians continue this strategy of degrade and destroy through attrition Ukrainian forces that are continuing to be pumped into this death pocket, this pocket of doom. And I've talked about that prior. So that's where we set for today. As always, thanks for joining us. More to come as we continue to cover events on the ground. As always, thanks for joining us.